Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As the Rio Olympics begin opening here this summer in August, there are many athletes that decided to stay behind because of the emerging epidemic known as the Zika virus. Well, many of us have heard about the virus, they've talked about it on the news, but sometimes we just can't really separate to know what the truth is from what the fiction is. Well, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who covers plagues and pestilence for the New York Times. His front-page reporting continues to be instrumental in focusing the nation on this terrifying outbreak known as Zika. We're going to talk about the behind-the-scenes story of the origins of the Zika and its dramatic 2016 spread and how it was eventually communicated to the public at large. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today the author of the book Zika, the Emerging Epidemic, our guest, Donald G. McNeil, Jr. Donald, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, when the Zika thing came up, this is my thoughts on this. When we started hearing our government a couple of years back talking about Ebola, and I'm thinking, are these people out of their minds? I mean, this was something 30 years ago that really didn't get very far, and all of a sudden they're alarming our country, and yet it was still over in Africa. And I'm thinking, okay, what are they making up now? And you got to kind of follow that trajectory sometimes because you really can't separate what we're being told from the truth, it seems sometimes.
I don't mean to disagree with you, but you'd have to follow the history of Ebola to understand why last year's or 2 years ago Ebola epidemic was much different from the first 19 Ebola outbreaks. I actually thought the same thing myself in the beginning. I was looking at it and saying, oh, okay, there's another outbreak in West Africa. There have been 19 before. They've smothered all the rest of them with small teams of experts who went in and buried bodies and told people to stay away from corpses. But this one was different. That one basically got to the capital cities. It wasn't in some little tiny village on the edge of a river. It got to the capital cities, and it got to 3 different capital cities. That's when you have epidemic spread, and that's when you have to have a big response, and that's why ultimately hundreds of American doctors and missionaries and nurses went over there to fight it, and some of them brought it back to this country. So it was a very different outbreak of Ebola in 2014 than it was the previous 19 outbreaks. Zika is a whole different story itself. It's a completely different disease, but that one was a scare, and it was different.
Well, now, what makes this Zika virus really scary to me is that you're looking at a generation of children. Well, why don't we just talk about this from point A to point B, because I think people are going to be very disturbed by this. It's sort of like you're seeing the epidemic now of children being born with autism, or at least on the autistic spectrum. This seems a lot bigger than that.
Well, this is very different from that. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of children in this country with varying degrees of autism, and we don't know the cause. I mean, there's all sorts of crazy rumors about causes like vaccines, like icebox mothers. Like there've been sort of one silly ass theory about autism after another. But this is different. This one we know the cause of. The total number of babies damaged so far is in the thousands. I mean, right now there's about 2,000 confirmed cases of microcephaly in Brazil. Once they finish all the confirmations, it's probably likely to rise around to 5,000 or so. The problem is, in this case, this is not just autism. I mean, kids with autism, I've got cousins with autism. I think a lot of guys I know are on the spectrum to one extent or another, probably including me. But for people, this is children born with birth defects so severe that they will never be able to breathe properly, to walk properly, to think, to speak, to control their bowels, to do the most basic functions of human life. And it's going to mean that they are going to have to be taken care of 24 hours a day, night and day for the rest of their lives. It's the most kind of severe damage you can imagine. Fortunately, there's 3 million babies born in Brazil every year, and we're talking about 5,000 or 6,000 babies that may end up with this devastating condition. The thing is, the mosquitoes carrying the disease are in the United States. They're at least in the southern United States, in the sort of tropical parts of it, and they could carry it here if we're not careful. So it's absolutely crucial that the country mounts some sort of response to this before there are babies in the continental United States ending up in that condition. They already are in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and American Samoa, which are American territory.
Now, what's been alarming as well is just how fast this has been spreading from, let's say, South America up to the southern parts of the United States, even as far up as I understand, as close to Minnesota. And then you're talking about going out to the Polynesian Islands. How is this possible that this is spreading so widely and seemingly so quick?
Well, you're talking about two different kinds of spread here. I mean, the case in Minnesota, that's a traveler from Minnesota who flew to a country, got the disease there, and flew back. There has not been any transmission by mosquitoes in Minnesota, and I am sure there will not be because the right mosquitoes are not in Minnesota. The right mosquitoes are the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, and they exist in this country all the way up sometimes as far as New York City, but that's usually in the very hottest summers and the hottest times of the year for a few weeks. The only time that they're really prevalent much of the year is Florida, the Gulf Coast, Texas, and parts of Hawaii. But there's worry about Southern California, too, because there's some of the mosquitoes there, and there's lots of people that go back and forth between Latin America and Los Angeles, and they can bring the disease back and transmit it to the mosquitoes. And that's really the answer to the question that you asked, is how does this disease spread so fast around the world? It's not mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are lucky if they fly a mile in their lives. It's humans that you get the disease, say, on one island in Polynesia, and you get on a plane, and the virus stays in your blood for 10 days. You get off the plane 6 hours later someplace far away, and you get bitten by a local mosquito, and then it gets the disease and transfers it to somebody else. You don't only need a few people to do that, to seed an epidemic in a new place when the right mosquitoes are there and when nobody has immunity to the disease.
Okay, so now we're talking about transmission versus thinking it's a mosquito spread, and I think that's where a lot of times people get that confused, obviously.
Yeah, there's two kinds of transmission. This is the only mosquito-borne disease that is also sexually transmitted, and that's why it's so astonishing to scientists. There's never been one like this before. This one is also sexually transmitted. All previous cases until today, all described cases had been male to female, or in one case, male to male. Today, there was the first case described in New York City of a woman giving it to a man, which really surprised people, too.
Now, the virus is also, from what I understand, is more than 300 women who are pregnant in the United States and its territories were infected with the Zika virus. And we were told that in early June, and it grows every week. How much is this growing by? Some dozens every week. This is women who have in Puerto Rico. It's women who are getting bitten by mosquitoes right there. At Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands. In the United States proper, in the 50 states, it's so far it's all travel cases or a few sexually transmitted cases, women infected by their husbands or boyfriends. But it's mostly travel cases. Women who've been to these countries, got bitten by a mosquito there, came back here, and now they're pregnant and they have Zika. And there's no cure, there's no treatment. All you can really do for those women is give them an ultrasound every 2 or 3 weeks. And if the baby starts to develop signs of brain damage, then the woman has to make a choice as to whether or not she wants to terminate the pregnancy or not. And it shows up on an ultrasound, and it's terrifying. I mean, I read through the record of one case of a woman who had several ultrasounds, and she was fine, and then the next one that came along, suddenly you could see the brain literally beginning to dissolve. It was really scary. Well, there's no doubt about that when you consider that it's estimated that close to 5 million babies will be born in these areas of the Americas within the next year. I mean, we're talking 5 million people. That's pretty alarming.
That's 5 million babies at risk. That doesn't necessarily mean that all their mothers are going to get the disease. Fortunately, now that the word is out, now that the alarm has spread from Brazil, people are beginning to take precautions, and I'm not expecting anything like 5 million babies to actually end up with brain damage. I'm expecting it to be in the thousands. But, this has happened before, even in the United States. In 1964-65, that was our last big outbreak of German measles in this country, and that was a similar disease to this, where, mom, dad, big brothers and sisters get it, it's not a big deal. But if a pregnant woman gets it, the baby can be born blind, can be born deaf, can be born with a tiny head and severe learning disabilities, or can die in the womb. So, and that was in those years, 20,000 babies affected. So it was a serious issue then.
Now, I understand, and it was kind of surprising to hear this, because when you first hear about it, just within the last year, you think it's something new. But the Zika virus was actually discovered back in 1947?
Correct. It was discovered in a monkey in the Zika forest in Uganda. which sounds like, it's called the overgrown forest. It sounds remote and scary, but it's actually just outside the capital on the way to the airport. And scientists, it was British territory then, and scientists, joint British and Rockefeller Foundation scientists, they built towers in the forest, and they were hoisting monkeys in cages up to the top of the trees, because there are different mosquitoes at different levels, and they would bring them down each night and check their temperatures. And Rhesus number 766 developed a fever, and they took it into the lab and they were looking for yellow fever and related diseases. They figured out it wasn't yellow fever, and then through a long process of elimination using literally hundreds of mice, they ultimately worked out that it was a new virus that nobody had ever discovered before, and so they named it Zika.
Now, when it comes to the Olympics, this is a really big deal. Let's talk about what the risk is for people who decide they want to attend as spectators of the Olympics.
Okay. The CDC and the World Health Organization are real clear. Pregnant women should not go to the Olympics. And any man who goes needs to be, who's sleeping with a pregnant woman or a woman who's trying to get pregnant, needs to be extremely careful. With a pregnant woman, basically no unprotected sex for the rest of the pregnancy. Even if the woman's trying to get pregnant, they should probably avoid unprotected sex for 6 months, because the possibility is that a man can get sick and then have the virus actually in his testicles and spread it through his semen after that, spread it to infect the woman that way. For everybody else, they say go ahead and go to the Olympics, and the reason is, August in Rio is winter. Now, winter in Rio doesn't mean Jack Frost and snowman. It means temperatures in the 70s, but instead of in the 90s. But there's a big drop in mosquito transmission of disease in their winter. Also, Rio's had a big epidemic of it, so a lot of people are already immune to it. So it'll be harder for the mosquitoes to pick up the virus from anybody's blood and transfer it to visitors and athletes. And also, the assumption is kind of a lot of visitors are going to be staying in hotel rooms, and they'll be in the Olympic venues, and they'll be fairly protected. I mean, there's reasons to worry about the Olympics, including crime rate and pollution in the Bay, but Zika is not considered a threat to anybody who's not pregnant or not with a pregnant woman. That said, everybody has to make their own choices. The athletes who are dropping out, I'm frankly kind of skeptical of a lot of that talk. I mean, I'm noticing that it's the male golfers who are dropping out, but many of them are in contention for the FedEx Cup, and they need to keep their points on the board to make that cup, and that cup is worth $10 million. But meanwhile, the female golfers, who are much more at risk than the male ones, are not dropping out. Male basketball players, many of whom make millions of bucks playing in the NBA, are dropping out. Female basketball players are not. It's making me wonder if Zika is the real reason here, or whether or not we're talking about money.
Well, that's an interesting point. Certainly it's one to be noted. There's no doubt about that. Now, if someone does get bitten, what are the symptoms that they can experience from this, and how soon will they show up?
Okay. 80% of the people who get it will never have any symptoms. They won't know they had the disease. It's like I said, it's a mild disease. It's so mild that in some cases people don't even know it. The 20% that get it, they tend to get a fever. Usually not a high fever. It sort of tops out at 102 or 103. A rash. It's a red bumpy rash, kind of like a hives rash. It's not like a chicken pox, the little blisters rash. And they get bloodshot eyes, conjunctivitis, and also headache, sensitivity to light, joint pains, and sometimes swollen joints. And it usually comes on within 3 to 10 days, and then after that it usually disappears within 10 days. And almost nobody nobody dies of it alone. Almost nobody's ever hospitalized from it. It's not as bad as malaria. It's not as bad as yellow fever. It's not as bad as dengue. It's not as bad as chikungunya, other mosquito diseases. But if you're pregnant, it's seriously bad news for your baby.
Now, it's just so unusual. You kind of wonder why it works the way it does.
That's still being worked on. Mm-hmm. It's not entirely clear how it crosses the placenta, although I got some new papers theorizing about that today, and it seems to attack a particular kind of cell in the baby's growing brain that's known as the radial glia cells, and those are the ones that act kind of like the scaffolding or the architecture that other cells use to find their way. I mean, when the brain grows a little bit like a building, and first you put up the superstructure, and then you put on the flooring and the ceilings, and these are the cells that form the superstructure of the growing brain, and they seem to be the ones that get infected. And there's a receptor on the outside called the AXL receptor, like Axl Rose, and that seems to be the one that the virus targets. But this is all very early science. It's only been studied for literally for a matter of months in some cases. So we haven't got a complete picture yet.
Now, it's really interesting, because the concern is, of course, women who want to have babies. How soon could I have a baby if, in fact, the Zika virus is prevalent somewhere? Those are certainly questions to be answered. But then there's also in vitro fertilization. I thought, that was something you wouldn't think of before. So you have male sperm donors who might have been infected with the Zika virus. What kind of a threat would that cause for men who decide to go this direction?
Well, I'm hoping that sperm banks are taking exactly the same precaution that blood banks are taking now. There are tests for virus in the sperm. In the same way that a blood bank will ask you about your travel history, the sperm bank should be asking you about your travel history. So, yeah, you would not want sperm from a donor who had been infected. Fortunately, they can test it if it's any time in the first 10 days of infection, and also by screening people through travel histories, you're hoping there's very little risk from that. You mentioned before, can women go ahead and have babies? It's kind of a misconception that women can't have babies for life if they get Zika. It's quite the opposite. It's more like this is a disease that you get it, it's gone in about 10 days to 2 weeks or so, and then after that you're safe. You have immunity, and so a woman can go on to have healthy babies after that. It's sort of the way that, you don't have chickenpox for life, you don't have smallpox for life, you don't have measles for life. You get it, you get over it, and, in smallpox you sometimes don't get over it, but for the other diseases you usually get over it, and then you're immune. So women who've actually been bitten and have had Zika, as long as they're not pregnant, they're basically, it acts like a vaccine. They're protected against it. We don't know if it's lifetime, but we know it's long-lasting.
So there are tests that they can actually conduct to find out whether or not you do have it then?
Yeah, there's two kinds of tests. There's virus tests and antibody tests. The virus tests are very accurate, but they have to be given within the first 10 days or so of the infection. After that, there's some problems because the virus is so similar to dengue fever and yellow fever and a few other things that the tests tend to cross-react. The antibody tests cross-react. The thing is that almost nobody in the United States has had yellow fever shots or dengue fever, so the antibody tests are likely to work better inside the United States than they do in Latin America and the Caribbean, where a lot of people have had the other diseases. So probably they're going to get a pretty good handle on whether or not somebody's had Zika from an antibody test too.
Now, this is also fascinating, and I'm wondering in the mainstream media, what kind of information are they sharing with the public that you might find a little bit suspect?
Well, I suppose if I work for the New York Times, I'm considered mainstream media. I don't like to speak for the whole media. I like to speak just for my work. I don't even get to speak for the whole New York Times.
No, actually, what it is, not specifically, it's just, mainstream, like, you happenstance, you come across, there's a newscaster. It really doesn't even really matter what the station is. It's, to me, sort of the general message that people may be getting that you feel, well, let's kind of give them more detail about this so they don't go, it's sort of like me. I'm looking at the map in the front of your book. I remember as I was reading, thinking, okay, is this being spread by mosquitoes? See, you don't really hear stuff like that. You don't know how is it being transmitted specifically. And so and you hear what people talk about around you, and they come to the same conclusions that I might just by looking at a map. Oh, so these mosquitoes are now in Minnesota. And I'm thinking, well, that's not possible, but...
Well, the map should say that the mosquitoes could potentially get to Minnesota in a particularly hot summer. I'm so suspicious of media and things like that it matters to me not only what paper I read it in, but who wrote it for that paper. So I actually read people's bylines because I know some reporters are smarter and more accurate than others. So I don't think of things as just the mainstream media versus the alternative media versus one other kind of media. I look very carefully at whether or not I believe something. So Al Jazeera and Fox News I will look at differently as sources of information. Both accurate or inaccurate, depending on whether or not my BS meter goes crazy or not. Even when I read the New York Times, I tend to look at which reporter is writing the story. So I mean, what I find is generally true of this epidemic, which is true of all epidemics, is that in the beginning there's too much panic. Part of my job is to try to not to spread panic, but to spread reasonable caution, and it's often hard for me to figure out what's reasonable, especially early in an epidemic. You don't know. I mean, swine flu was a perfect example. That was a disease that was racing through the population. I mean, there was no way to stop it. Lots and lots of people were infected. But we didn't know for several months that it was turning out to be a relatively mild flu because it was a new virus. It was a new mix of old viruses into a new virus, and you can't always tell whether or not they've got some small mutations that can make a huge difference in whether or not the flu is like last year's no big deal flu or is like the 1918 flu that killed several million people. So it sometimes takes a while, and when the media reports on a new epidemic, they tend to get a little too alarmist, but then eventually if you read good media like mine, you get a sense of, oh, okay, maybe I should worry exactly this much, but not too much. And you also have to dig into these things, I mean, you have to really look into, is it, you and I both know that mosquitoes don't spread very widely in Minnesota, certainly in winter, but there are mosquitoes all over Minnesota in summer, so you can sort of, take a look at it and maybe dig deeper on the internet and figure out whether or not the tropical mosquitoes you're worried about are the ones that are likely to be there, and the answer is no, not very likely.
Well, it's certainly alarming to know that it could be transmitted sexually, and you also realize that that's very much, how AIDS spread as well, also with the sharing of dirty needles as well. So this is something to really be thinking about, on your mind so that you can protect yourself from the Zika virus. What are the chances your partner, happen to get this? And, that's one of the things. What are some of the other things people can also do to protect themselves from this?
That's pretty much it. I mean, first of all, if you're not pregnant or not sleeping with somebody who's pregnant, don't worry about it too much. That's the main thing to do. I mean, even if you get it, I mean, I may get it next week when I go to Puerto Rico, and I'm, since I'm not pregnant and I'm not trying to get anybody pregnant, it's not going to be the end of the world for me. If you're pregnant, you should, the main thing you should do is stay away from any area where the Zika is being transmitted, because, I mean, yes, you should, use DEET or picaridin or IR 3535, one of the EPA approved insect repellents. You should wear long sleeves. But if you're a pregnant woman, if the goal is to try to avoid mosquito bites 24 hours a day for 9 months, good luck with that. That's real tough. So you can follow the CDC's advice, but it only takes you so far, unfortunately, because there's some things that are very hard to do, and one of them is avoiding mosquito bites for 9 months. Also, sleep with people where where they've been. I mean, that's generally good advice all the time. So whether you're talking about HIV or syphilis or what's normally a mosquito-borne virus, it's a good idea to be careful the first time with somebody new, and maybe the second time and third time and fourth time too, so you know them and trust them a little better.
Wow, it's just amazing, how something like this can actually occur. The book is Zika, The Emerging Epidemic. Our guest joining us today, Donald G. McNeil, Jr. If you could, is there a website people can go and find out more information about this?
Well, I don't have a personal website.
Okay.
I've got a page on the New York Times website, so you can go on the New York Times .com and just type in my name, you'll come to my personal page, which has all the stories I've written in the last 6 months. For updated information, I would say go to someplace like cdc.gov or PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, or the World Health Organization. They have accurate, updated information on their sites for people. CDC is aimed specifically at American citizens. The WHO and PAHO are aimed basically at the world.
Well, very good. Donald, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program and giving a lot more clarity about what this Zika is and what we can do about it. It's certainly a lot more enlightening than what we tend to think before. We're not getting everything we feel we need to know about something like this.
Good. Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you for inviting me. Okay. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you to the listeners out there for tuning in. You can also discover more by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our weekly e-newsletter so you can stay up to date on what's happening here in the world of Beyond 50. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.